Hello and welcome to the Actual Magician. Yes, I am an Actual Magician's bookshelf channel. Today I'm going to be kicking off a new series which will interweave between all of the other videos, and this is my top 100 usable cartomantic decks. This includes tarot decks, oracle decks and other forms of cartomancy, as we'll come to take a look at. And I'm going to be roughly looking at about 10 each video, and here is my top 10, I guess. These are the decks that have lasted with me over the last 45 years and I use a lot. And that's one of the main things with this channel and also with this series, is that these are decks that I've used over 45 years, that I've tested, that have stayed with me, and I actually find useful in all sorts of different ways. Now, some people say, why do you have so many tarot decks? Why not just have one tarot deck? But I always say it's a bit like books. They're only the same 26 letters of the English alphabet, just rearranged, so why have more than one book? And it's the same with tarot. Every single tarot deck is like a new album, a new book, a new piece of art. It gives you a very different way of engaging and looking at the universe. So let's get started. We're going to start perhaps back in history a little bit, and I'm also going to be giving a few tips as to how to use these decks and how to use tarot and cartomantic and oracular decks in general. So I'm going to be taking them out of this box, but I will start with our first one, which is actually more of a personal story, and this is my very first tarot deck as well. When I was 13, I got a Stuart Kaplan book out of the adult library and had special dispensation to go upstairs into the adult library at Belper Library, and I bought a Stuart Kaplan book just simply called The Tarot, and I did get to joke with Stuart Kaplan and thank him for opening the world of tarot to me just shortly before he passed, and he joked that he perhaps should have charged me a licensing fee or a copyright fee for doing what I did, which was I actually made my own tarot deck. And this is the actual deck. I only had access to sellotape, not glue, so I sellotaped. My dad had an old photocopier, one of the first photocopiers, this huge beast of a machine, and he photocopied them on a Saturday morning for me. And this is the IJJ or 1JJ deck, a Swiss deck, and it has Juno and Jupiter as two of the cards in this, and it has the Motley Fool here. And so this is the deck that I first started reading tarot cards with, and I took it into school. There's Jupiter as Atu 5, the Emperor, the Hierophant, get my cards right, and I hadn't learned at this point how to read tarot, in the sense of there wasn't any instructions in the Stuart Kaplan book. There might have been some at the back perhaps, and if so, it was a Celtic cross, and basically I took these cards in this wonderful old coffee bean bag. The irony of an oracular system being the reading of coffee grounds, I guess, and I thought this was pretty cool, and I had it on my belt. And I went into school in order to do readings for people. And I read for my friends and even one of the teachers. And I would do 3 or 4 readings a day, and I would take the cards home and study them and so forth. And I read reversals, and I only read the Major Arcana in the Celtic cross, because at that point, a book hadn't come along to tell me that that wasn't the way to do it, that wasn't how you should read tarot. You should read the full deck, or you shouldn't read reversals, or you should use different spreads other than the Celtic cross, and certainly not majors only with reversals in a Celtic cross. That would be too difficult. But luckily enough, I didn't learn that these things were supposed to be difficult, so it never worried me. And this is my first deck then, and my first to kick off our series of top 100 influential decks, certainly on my life, and the decks that have stayed with me all of that time. And so I guess number 1 is the Swiss 1JJ deck, majors only, and that's our first deck. I do have methods in Tarosophy and Tarosophy Squared for reading with majors only. It's very easy to do. It's a lot easier than you might think, and it can be done for mundane everyday questions because I did it for 2 years before I bought my first tarot deck, and I would read for friends and family sometimes, and we were 13, 14, 15, so our questions were relatively mundane. So, deck number 2 in our list is the Aquarian Tarot by David Palladini. Now, this was the first tarot deck that I actually bought. I never had the idea that someone should have to gift you a deck or something like this. That's a load of nonsense. Still haven't found out where that idea actually came from. It was probably relatively recently in historical terms, but we still haven't found the very first person to have written that down, at least. I don't think it was a Golden Dawn teaching or from Eliphas Levi, maybe. Who knows? I still haven't found a source for that. But this was the first deck that I bought. This is the actual working deck here. I'm showing its age a little bit. This is probably about 45, 43 years ago now. And so I thought this deck was really, really super cool. It's sort of modernistic, Art Nouveau. It was the Aquarian deck, and I'm an Aquarian, so that suited me. And this was really my significator for when I was a young youth going into occultism as the Page of Wands, and I really identified with this card. This is one of my favourite cards of all time, I think. And the High Priestess, and we were lucky enough to feature a retrospective on David Palladini's work in one of the Tarosophist International magazines that is free to members of the Tarot Association. So if you want to find out more about David Palladini's life and his art, a guy called Michael Iacarino, I think, did a wonderful article and an interview with David Palladini and featured the artwork. So this is my second most influential deck as far as I'm concerned, and I still use it, although there are now a couple of other versions. There's the new Palladini version, which is a sort of retouched version, a remade version, and I have to say I'm not as fond of this one as the original Aquarian deck, but I do like it. That's probably because the Aquarian deck has such a strong part in my own history. So the Aquarian deck is my number 2 deck. You can see it's very influenced by the Waite-Smith images, for example, the Four of Swords there. And you can also now get the Aquarian Tarot in a tin. I haven't used this one as much. I don't know why. It's a smaller version. It still pops. It's still quite neat in terms of the artwork and so forth. Very beautiful art. But I think once you have bonded with a deck, it's like sheep here in the Lake District out the window there. They heft to a particular place and they always stay within that particular area. And I think I've hefted to this particular deck myself. So that's where the Aquarian Tarot, as they say, with some shelfware. And that's deck number 2 on my list. Deck number 3 on my list, of course, I guess you would have to say, of course, is the Waite-Smith Tarot. Now, this has a box that was made for me by a fellow occultist back in the day. It's made out of cork and it was specifically built for my deck. This was the second deck I bought. I may have bought it roughly at the same time as the Aquarian, I can't recall, but it was certainly within a few weeks of each other. And so the Waite-Smith deck is obviously a classic. At the time, I felt that it was very evocative, and obviously it was a variation to me of the Aquarian deck, and I could see more detail in this. So there was for me, I think I had a lot of trouble reading the minors because I'd spent a couple of years already reading majors only. The minors seemed somewhat overwhelming, and the court cards even more so. So over the years, I've had to come up with new methods and ways of figuring out the court cards and figuring out the minor arcana as well. And I wouldn't have thought at the time that I actually started reading with this deck and actually bought this deck that I'd eventually come to co-author with my co-author Tarly Goodwin, Secrets of the Waite-Smith Tarot, and come up with a whole load of, even after 35, 40 years, a whole load of new research actually showing where some of these images come from. For example, the Queen of Swords is actually Hjordis, and Pamela Coleman-Smith actually drew Ellen Terry as Hjordis, and Hjordis literally means sword goddess or Queen of Swords. And so this explains why we have the tassels on the Queen of Swords, because it's a variation of this drawing here. Pamela Coleman-Smith obviously drew on what she knew, which was the theatre, and this is where her designs come from. And obviously we have Waite's influence, and also here is the actual, if you can see, if I can show this, Pamela Coleman-Smith here, that's her actual entry into the Golden Dawn register of members, and so we have her magical name, who she was initiated with into the Golden Dawn as well. And my, what are we looking at, third or fourth deck is obviously going to be the Thoth deck, and Aleister Crowley was another alumni of the Golden Dawn, so we have a lot to thank the Golden Dawn for. So that's my third most influential and still used deck. I always revert to this deck, but still see something new in it, in the combinations and the images and the design of it and Waite's writing on it every day, even 45 years later. So we never really stop learning. And my fourth deck is the one I carry about in this spooky looking black bag. And this, of course, has to be the Thoth Tarot by Aleister Crowley. Let's get that the right way up. So this is, I think, the first version of the Thoth that I actually bought, the US game system one. And I'm aware that there are lots of other versions that have come out since, and so this is the OTO version of the Thoth Tarot. And for me, the Thoth Tarot was full of enigma and mystery and alchemy and sexual magic and all sorts of comparative religion. And the Book of Thoth I bought at the same time from the Ace of Wands occult shop, seem to recall. And so the work of Lady Frida Harris in this is absolutely astonishing. And this is a deck that I've looked at over the last 45 years and consistently blows me away by the artwork. And even on the minors, where it looks apparently simplistic, the actual design and the colouring of it is astonishing. And the fact is we have 5 years of letters between Lady Frida Harris and Aleister Crowley on the design of this deck that we don't have for the Waite-Smith deck. So as a result, this deck is a little bit more transparent and in a sense less mystical, less magical than the Waite-Smith, about which we have to guess or interpret and project symbolism into it and interpretation into it, whereas this we actually have a good record of what the designer and the artist were trying to get at with each of the cards. That's not to say that the Book of Thoth is a simple book to read. It's one of the most confusingly laid out books to actually study. And that's why I eventually came to write Secrets of the Thoth Tarot, book 1, to talk about the background of Thelema and what Crowley was attempting to do with his deck, which was basically an illustration, a piece of propaganda, a pamphlet for his teaching of Thelema, for his teaching of the worldview of Thelema, magical worldview. And then I did volume 2 on the Minor Arcana, where I bring in the I Ching and Geomancy, which is the fundamental structure of that deck. And then book 3 on the court cards, showing how Crowley used the court cards to demonstrate his astonishing appreciation of human beings and our fallibilities, our flaws, and the way personalities actually work. And so that's my 3 volumes on that. And in writing those, I came to reappreciate just how deep and astonishing these cards actually are. Crowley was working towards the latter part of his life on this deck, so it's a summation of all of his teaching and his experience from the Golden Dawn, sexual magic, Eastern religion, geomancy, Kabbalah, Thelema, Christian mysticism, the apocalypse, biblical revelations, ancient Egyptian magic. All of these things are jammed into this in a perfect design. And so this is my 4th and certainly one of the more influential decks that I have used and still use to this day. Okay, for my 5th most influential or important or useful deck that I've found over the last 45 years, again, I'm going to return to one of my earlier decks, the Psycards. I got this one from the Tarot Workshop in Mansfield, Cheshire. Yeah, so I bought this fairly early on, and the important thing with this deck is the fact that it's really simple, it's really straightforward. So we have literal cards that say yes, friendship, the message. One card literally says the Inquirer, so you don't need to worry about which zodiacal symbol to apply to a court card in order to select it, and so forth. And here's our no card, and I think there's a maybe card in here as well. So I use this deck an awful lot for really simple readings, and sometimes as, I guess, a clarifier to a tarot reading. If I wanted a straightforward answer, here's a card that says never. I think that's a reference to Edgar Allan Poe, Nevermore, perhaps with the bird on that. And there is a new version of this that comes with a book as well, so there's an actual book there. But I've always found it, just from the booklet itself, to be very self-explanatory. And as one example of how bloody dynamic and powerful this deck can actually be, I once did a health reading, and I really don't do health readings, but a client had asked me to do a reading, which I'd done, and then afterwards she said if I had time to do just one reading to put her mind at rest, and it was about her pregnancy, and she was pregnant. And so I said, well, I don't do health readings, but we can do one to what would set your mind at rest with your pregnancy. And I literally laid out the cards and laughed and said it's almost a con, me charging you to interpret this, because it was the mother and birth. The first 2 cards were mother and birth for a pregnancy reading. And then the next card was the body, and that made me think about obviously medical issues and so forth. And then I started to internally freak out a little bit, because I obviously didn't want to do a reading without clarifying that one should always consult the experts in a particular area as well as tarot cards. And then I got the sage, which I obviously interpreted as the doctor, and then yes. And it was quite interesting, this yes at the end of it. So it was a positive reading, thank heavens for that, of birth, mother, body, sage, yes. And I looked at it and I got the really important message for this card. And I said to her, again, take this for what it is worth. This is a tarot card, oracle card reading for your situation. But to me, I would interpret it, say, birth, mother, body. The doctor will have a opinion when you're giving birth, at the moment of birth, and say yes to it. That seems to be what the cards are suggesting. And sure enough, the client came for another reading later on, after the birth and so forth, and she said, by the by, and she didn't think it was that important, which was, I guess, a good thing, is that at the last minute of the pregnancy, the doctor had suggested something. He was slightly concerned about something and had suggested they take a particular change of decision to the birth plan. And she immediately said yes to that. And afterwards it transpired that having made that decision had been very important. It had really made a big difference, even though he was doubtful at the time. Then it was a good yes. So saying yes to the doctor and the decision really worked out in that case. So again, these cards can be very, very dynamic, very direct. It wasn't until 25 years later that Talia and I re-emerged the Lenormand system, and people started to talk about how literal it was, how direct it was, how it was better than tarot for everyday readings. But I'd always found that the Psycards were definitely already doing that for 30 years before then. And so I really recommend this particular deck. And also the version with the book as well. Let me just show you the book whilst I have you here. Oh, if I can get it out of the box. There we go. It's by Nick Hobson. This is the US Games reprint of that. And so we have some similar cards like the Fool. And we have thought prompts for each of the cards here. But again, I think the cards are so literal anyway that it's fairly a straightforward system to use. But I found the booklet very, very useful as well. And there are some exercises at the back of this book as well. Okay, so that's the Psycards, my fifth most influential tarot deck, certainly in my own experience over the last 45 years. And that's the version in the box as well. So my sixth most influential deck or useful deck, and certainly this goes into useful decks, is the Philosopher's Stone. Now, unfortunately, this is one of the oracle decks or tarot decks. And again, I bought this from the Tarot Workshop. I obviously gave them a lot of good business back in the day. And this has had a lot of wear. It's been with me around the world several times. And unfortunately, this one is out of print. So if you do see a copy of it and you're interested, then grab it no matter the price, because it is out of print. And these are sort of stone images. So this one is Composure, card number 8. Stop, and you can't get a better picture of stop than that. Light. So there's some abstract ones. Task, I quite like the collaborative nature of this task, perhaps delegating downwards. Success, the one stone arising out of the others, always leaving a shadow in its place. Breakthrough. I did a series of photographs of these cards during one of the first lockdowns on a kitchen floor where the light kept shining through. I was able to place the cards with the light and the shadow on the kitchen tiles going through the card, and it really pointed out just how light is important in this deck. Depth. This deck I often use as a one-card draw, as a reminder card for a client. So I will draw out a single card and say, this is the card that you can remember from the rest of the reading. If I've done a tarot card reading, and I give them this card and take a photo with it as a gift for them to take away and contemplate. I often use these cards just for contemplative work itself. I lay out 3 cards and just sit and meditate on their meaning and interpretation rather than actually doing a reading, although obviously the reading will still apply. And I just wanted to find one particular card in this deck that is one of my favourite designs of all time, and that is card number 40, Solution. And this is the perfect card and design for all divination, for all NLP, for all neo-Ericksonian hypnotherapy, where we use utilization and incorporation into everything. And to be honest, all counselling, self-help and developmental work, that the answer is always in the question. And we see that through the challenge that the question is presenting to us. And the answer is always there. There's the solution. And I just love the simplicity of the design of this. It's one of my favourite all-time. Out of the several thousand decks that I have, this single card, this single image, to me encapsulates the heart of what we're doing in our lives. And so this is why the Philosopher's Stone is certainly one of my favourite and influential decks. So that's number 6, the Philosopher's Stone by an artist who goes by the name of DS, D-E space E-S, and this is the Philosopher's Stone deck. So deck number 7 in my list of 100 top influential decks is this deck here, the Tyldwick Tarot by Neil Lovell. This is the Fool on this side, and this is the World on this side. Now, unfortunately, Neil passed away a little while ago, and it was a pleasure to have talked to him, emailed with him, corresponded with him when he was first designing a deck, because I really wanted to encourage him to produce a tarot deck based on his images. I think he had a nascent website back in the day, and I was in an organisation trying to encourage people to make tarot decks. And the beauty of this deck, and I'll hold this so that we can see it clearly, is that it has no figures in it, that it is entirely empty. The design of the deck, the conceit of the deck, is that it's an old deserted house. And so here we have the 6 of Cups that are represented by the plant pots and the watering can here on a ledge outside of the wall of the house. And every card in this, now there is a slight cheat with the court cards because it's difficult to do a court card without a figure. So the King of Swords, there's usually a reflection or an image, but that is only a minor part of the design of the card. So there's the King of Cups, and you can see the difference. It's instantly recognisable because the design is so perfect, and you'll notice that there's some elemental attributions put in there as well, with the wings and the butterflies and various other designs like the fan, the peacock wings for the air for the swords, and obviously the tap and the water and the sort of bathing house tiles and so forth, the fountain here for the King of Cups. And so as we go through these cards, it's almost as if we're going through an empty house. And whilst this may seem almost impossible to read to some extent, here is the 2 of Coins, it forces you to project yourself as the viewer into every single card. And as a result, this is a perfect deck for self-exploration. This is the deck I use for myself an awful lot. When I do readings for myself, I tend to use this deck far more than, for example, the Waite-Smith or the Thoth decks, although I do sometimes use those. But this deck, the Tyldwick Tarot by Neil Lovell, Back in the day, it was through Malpertus Design, but I do think that his brother, I believe, has taken over the website and still sells the deck. So it's called the Tyldwick Tarot by Neil Lovell, if you're interested in a really beautiful deck and a very clever design that is followed through on in each of the cards. And you can see the Malpertus as well now a bit more clearly there. Beautiful, beautiful deck. And because it's semi-photography, it's art, but it has the design of photography, the eye of a photographer. I think I'm always a sucker for photographic decks, as we'll come and see in my top 100. There's a lot of photographic decks in there, and that's just personal to me. You'll find your own style, your own preferred design, your own preferred deck as you go along, and sometimes it changes. Mine certainly has over the last 45 years. My 8th deck is very different to the Malpertus deck, to the Tyldwick Tarot that we just looked at, and this is the Oracle of Initiation by Melissa Weiss-Steele. Also goes by the name of Melusine Luca, and this is available at the oracleofinitiation.com. I will just put that up there for you. And this is very different to the Tyldwick Tarot because this is, for one thing, it's a pure photography deck, and the other thing is that it is all faces. So whereas the Tyldwick Tarot was no figures and hardly any faces, the Oracle of Initiation is all faces. These were photographs taken out in the wild. So I'll show you some more closely. Recognition, isolation, confusion, retreat, and so forth. So this is, again, a perfect deck for self-examination. So this was first printed in 2010 and it's still available, and this is absolutely gorgeous for self-examination, for using with other people, for examining parts of themselves. There are some stylistic design cards in there as well to give it a structure, but it works very well without any particular structure being built into it. And the cards do have an awful lot of movement in them through the photography, and it's a really, really smart deck, and particularly when you've got a whole load of faces looking out at you from the table, it's very difficult to hide from the message that they're giving you. And this is why I really love this as a self-examination deck. So that's my 8th deck, the Oracle of Initiation. And my 9th deck, the penultimate deck in this particular video, is the Inner Scription Oracle by Ninky van Zwol. And I apologise if I have mispronounced her name. This is a more recent acquisition. I think it came out a few years ago. But this is a deck I've been using an awful lot and is still sticking with me. It doesn't go into rotation like a lot of my other decks, where I will use a deck for several months and then rotate it with a new deck and so forth. This has become one of my always present default decks. And one of the reasons I love this deck is because there's a particular word for it, and I can't remember what it is, but it's when you have symbolic characters that don't have a particular meaning. But each of these cards has a intimation that it has significance and meaning, and the hieroglyphs themselves being used and the colouring and their positioning, you really have to use your intuition for this deck. And it's interesting that there is a guidebook with it. If I can find the oracular guidebook here. So, asamic, there it is. There's the word. It's actually on the back of that. Asamic. So these cards do have keywords for them in the book. And I found that I tried to use the deck when I first had it without using the book, and then I eventually found that my meanings were gelling with what was in the book when I then came to look at it anyway. That's the power of the design of this deck. So when people say you have to use your intuition or you don't need intuition to read cards, try using this deck because it forces you by default to use your artistic appreciation, your intuition, your response to visual symbolism and images in order to read these cards. And I love this deck for deep readings, for I guess what you might call spiritual readings and self-examination as well. But it also works for everyday readings as well, but I tend not to use this deck for that. And my version came along with some very nifty bookmarks as well, which I sometimes put by the bed for meditation symbols and for dream work as well. So that's the Inner Scription Oracle by Ninky Van Zwol. And that's the 9th one on my list, the penultimate one for this video. And the 10th and final of this particular video of influential tarot decks, ones that have stuck with me, ones that I'm using today, is the Jolanda Tarot, published by AGM. Just put that there. There we go. Now, this deck by Hans Arnold, I'll see if I can find a picture that I took of its original form, because originally this deck had the most massive, and I'll put the picture up here if I can, purple borders around it. Horrible, horrible, horrible purple borders. And I understand the borders are used to protect the artwork, the area of the artwork on the card. So if the card gets damaged, it doesn't detract from the artwork. But this was ghastly. I have to say, this was ghastly in my view anyway. So what I did was I trimmed these cards. And I'll see if I can put up a picture up here as well of the trimmed version next to the original version. And so the trimmed version of these cards really pops. You can only see the artwork, and obviously the back of the cards is trimmed slightly close to the edges, but that was a price I was willing to pay to get the actual artwork popping out of those horrible borders. And as a result, this deck I use a lot for everyday readings. Let me just see if I can get some of the images up for you here. And I just love the style of them. They're very playful. They're very intriguing. They burst full of symbolism and interesting imagery. It's a world in itself. It's consistent. Each of the cards in design is consistent with the other cards. Some very odd cards here to some extent as well, because I've taken off any titling of the cards. You have to remember which card is which. I love this one here. 10 of Pentacles. And which swords that is. Some of them are easier to guess which card it is than the others, but that's the fun of having this deck. And I just love these designs. They're semi-Thoth, semi-Waite-Smith, semi-Jolanda itself, and I love the colouring on this as well. I used a lot of these designs in a magazine article a while ago and was struck by just how you can zoom in to some of the design points, and they're very consistent. They're very strong symbols, very strong images, like the figures hiding in the wands here and so forth. So that's the 10th. It's actually now, I guess, the smallest of the decks as well that I've shown you, because I've trimmed it. And I'd recommend as well, in terms of giving you hints and tips and background information as we go through this series, that you can trim a deck if you don't like the borders. It can sometimes make the deck for you. Make sure it's not the rarest deck you own before you lay at it with corner clippers and a guillotine, but that's certainly what I did with the Jolanda Tarot. So that's the 10th of the 100 decks that we're going to be taking a look at. Every week I'll be doing other videos in the other series, like the Magician Explains and so forth, but this series will wind in between those as and when I get time to actually do this. And any questions you have about tarot, please do drop a note below. Obviously, I've written a lot more about tarot publicly than I have about the Western Esoteric Initiatory system. So there's a lot of books that I can point you to as well if you're interested in any particular area of divination or cartomancy. And so we've come an awful long way over the 45 years since little Marcus made his first tarot deck and started reading for his school friends because he thought it was so cool. And to some extent, I guess it's ironic that perhaps when I did this, I wouldn't see where tarot would lead me, but I did know that it was something that was going to be very important, and that's why I kept this original deck as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this quick run through of 10 of the decks that I still have with me that I find useful and so forth. And I look forward to seeing you in other episodes of this series in the coming months. So thank you, and as ever, the worker is hidden in the workshop.